Okay, so you're here, and I bet you're probably looking for that kind of like intellectual shortcut,
Mm-hmm.
That way to really like grasp the essentials without like getting totally bogged down in all the details.
Yeah,
You want to be, well informed, but also you really want to like respect your time.
right.
And I think that's what the deep dive is all about, right?
Absolutely.
And today we are going to unlock a really powerful key to doing just that.
I love it.
Yeah.
So unlocking keys, what's the key?
What is the key? Well, we're diving into the 80-20 principle, or sometimes it's called the Pareto principle. Have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah. Very familiar.
Okay, cool. So for people who maybe haven't heard of it before, it's a deceptively simple idea
It really is.
with like huge implications.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
So the basic idea is the vast majority of results, so we're talking like around 80%,
Okay.
tend to stem from a small minority of causes, like roughly 20%.
Right.
And this wasn't just like some abstract notion that somebody came up with. It
Yeah.
actually originated from this guy, Vilfredo Pareto.
Oh, yeah. Pareto.
Yeah. And he was looking at Italy, and he noticed that 80% of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of just 20% of the population.
Yeah. And that's where the principle comes
Yeah.
from, like the observation of that.
Interesting. Yeah. So he was looking at like wealth distribution,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like exploded out into all these different areas.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's
Fascinating.
what's so cool about this principle is that it has applications in so many different fields.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to get into today.
Yeah, let's do it.
So our goal today is to really dissect this principle, and we're drawing from this really insightful book
Okay.
that really lays out how this 80-20 dynamic plays out in business, in your personal life,
Everywhere.
practically everywhere.
I love it.
Yeah,
So that's the exciting part.
it is. And we want to like equip you with like actionable strategies so you can start applying this immediately
Yes.
for greater efficiency and ultimately
Result.
the outcomes you're looking for.
Exactly.
Okay. So let's dive in. Let's get into the core of it.
All right. So chapter 1,
Okay.
very appropriately titled,
Laughing.
Welcome to the 80-20 Principle.
Okay.
Really establishes this fundamental concept that we just touched on, which is that in most situations that you're going to encounter, you're going to find that just a small fraction of your efforts or inputs will be the driving force behind the majority of your success.
So like not everything is created equal.
Not at all.
No.
Yeah,
I don't-
and we tend to think that it is.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest insights of this principle.
Okay. So think about it this way. So let's say you're thinking about your local coffee shop.
Okay, yes.
So you've got your local coffee shop,
Sure.
and they probably have like their regulars
Yeah.
who come in every single morning.
Right.
And that might be only 20% of their total customer base.
Right.
But those people are consistently buying, their coffee.
Yep, their daily brew.
Their daily brew.
Yeah,
And maybe a pastry.
and a pastry.
And that's
Or
like
a
a
great
breakfast
sandwich.
or a breakfast sandwich, yeah. Keep it healthy.
Right, exactly. But
So that regular habit probably accounts for like 80% of their revenue.
right,
As
exactly.
compared to like the person who pops in, in the afternoon, maybe just grabs a tea.
Yeah, once a week.
Yeah, once a week.
Or the evening crowd.
Yeah, exactly. So it's really about pinpointing that,
Vital few.
that vital few in your own endeavors.
Yes.
So what are those key clients?
Exactly.
The essential tasks,
Yeah.
the core elements that are really propelling the results that you care about.
It's identifying what those are
Yeah.
and then figuring out how to leverage that.
Okay, so the principle itself seems pretty straightforward.
It does.
But how do we actually train our minds to think in this 80-20 way?
Yeah, that's a good question.
So chapter 2 is how to think 80-20.
Right.
And it really explores that shift in perspective.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting here is this idea of moving away from linear thinking.
Okay.
So we're so conditioned,
Right.
like our schooling, the way that we think about things.
Like if you work harder,
Yeah, if you put in more effort,
you get more results.
you get more results. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's true to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But what the 80-20 principle shows us is that it's not a one-to-one relationship.
Okay.
Like a small, very highly focused effort can yield disproportionately large rewards.
I like that disproportionately large reward.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so they use this really relatable example of a student preparing for exams.
Okay, yeah.
So instead of trying to like absorb every single detail in this massive textbook,
Right.
which is like 100% effort, right?
Try to learn
He was
everything.
targeting 100% of the material.
Right. Be a completist.
Right.
Got to learn it all.
But the student who strategically focuses on, let's say, the key chapters that the professor highlighted,
Right.
or really diligently works through past exam papers,
Yeah.
maybe that's only 20% of their total study time.
Right.
They're likely to grasp 80% of what will be tested and
Exactly.
ultimately achieve better grades.
Yeah, you work smarter, not harder. And that's the whole point of this.
So it's about being really strategic
It is
with
that.
your effort.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the question then becomes like, where in your own life or work might you be spreading your energy too thinly?
Right.
Like, are there areas where you could step back, analyze the patterns of your effort and their outcomes,
Yeah.
and really pinpoint that, like, high-impact 20%?
Right. What's moving the needle the most?
Yeah.
What's actually giving you the results that you want?
Okay, so Chapter 3 introduces this idea of the underground cult.
Oh, yes.
Now, this isn't about, like,
Secret handshakes.
secret handshakes and shadowy figures.
No, not at all.
Okay.
No, this underground cult is more about, I think the point they're trying to make there is that a lot of very successful people and companies kind of intuitively understand this principle and they use it,
Okay.
but they don't necessarily call it the 80-20 principle.
Oh, so it's like they're doing it without even realizing it.
Yeah, they've just kind of figured out what works.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and they double down on what works.
Okay.
And so it's like an unspoken advantage that these high achievers have.
I like that.
Yeah.
Unspoken advantage. Okay, so give me an example of that. How does that play out in the real world?
Sure. So like a company like Apple,
Okay.
they don't, constantly release a ton of different products every year.
Right.
They're very strategic about,
They have a few key products.
a few key products
Yeah.
like the iPhone,
Right.
right? And they channel so much of their energy, their innovation, their marketing
Yeah.
into just those key products. And that's where they get the majority of their profits from.
Right. So it's almost like they're saying, like, we're not going to spread ourselves too thin.
Exactly.
We're going to really focus our energy on the things that we know are going to produce those outsized returns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're very much focused on where it truly matters.
Okay, so for our listeners then, what should they be looking for?
Well, I think what's really interesting is to start looking for these 80-20 patterns in your own industry.
Oh.
So look at companies that you admire.
Yeah.
Look at people that you admire
Mm-hmm.
and see, where is that disproportionate success originating? What are the driving forces behind it?
Interesting.
Yeah,
So kind of reverse engineer
exactly.
what other people are doing.
Yeah.
Okay, Chapter 4 takes a more challenging stance.
Okay.
It's called Why Your Strategy is Wrong.
Ooh, I like that.
It's a pretty bold statement.
It is bold.
So what are they saying here?
Well, they're really confronting this common approach to strategy, which is, to try to be balanced,
Okay.
to allocate your resources, your time, your energy equally across all areas.
So like a little bit of
A
everything.
little bit of everything. Yeah. And what this book argues is that pursuit of equilibrium can actually be less effective than really honing in and concentrating on that 20%.
Okay, so instead of being like a jack of all trades, master of none, you're saying
Yes.
really master that one thing.
Yeah, or a few key things.
Okay, so give me an example of how that might play out in the real world.
Okay, so let's say you have a clothing retailer,
Okay.
and they might have, racks and racks of different styles and colors and sizes.
Tons of options.
Yeah, tons of options.
Okay.
But oftentimes, it's those very basic items like your classic jeans, your plain T-shirts that actually sell the most
Yeah.
and account for, let's say, 80% of their sales.
The staples.
Yeah, the staples, exactly. And so the question then becomes, well, why not prioritize stocking and promoting those reliable bestsellers instead of trying to push, all these other less popular items?
So really double down on what's working.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I like that. And this is prompting us to really examine our current strategies.
It is.
Whether it's professional or personal,
Yeah.
are we holding on to low-impact activities out of a sense of obligation or maybe even fear of missing out?
Right. Could be.
Yeah. So the 80-20 perspective is suggesting that it might be more beneficial to just cut those out.
To reduce or eliminate those things that aren't really giving you a good return on your investment.
Okay, I like that Chapter 5 brings in this concept of simple is beautiful,
Yes.
and I'm all about that.
I am too.
Like, there's just power in stripping things down to the essentials.
Absolutely. The complexity can be such a barrier to effectiveness.
Yeah.
It just makes things so much harder. And so this 80-20 principle really inherently guides us towards simplicity
Okay.
because it's forcing us to identify what truly matters.
Okay.
And when we realize that, a small number of factors are actually driving most of the outcomes, it naturally leads us to eliminate all that unnecessary clutter.
So how does that play out in like a tangible example?
Sure. So let's say you have a restaurant
Okay.
and they have this enormous menu, like 50 different dishes.
Oh my gosh.
That requires a lot, right?
Yeah.
A lot of ingredients, a lot of different skills in the kitchen, and inevitably there's going to be some waste.
Yeah.
But what if they look at their sales data
Okay.
and they realize that 80% of their customers are ordering from just 10 of those dishes? So 20% of the menu is driving most of the business.
Interesting.
Right. So what if they simplify their offerings down to just those best sellers?
Okay.
What happens? Well, they can reduce costs, probably improve the quality of those core dishes.
Yeah, because they're making them all the time.
Exactly. They're getting really good at making those dishes, and then it streamlines the entire kitchen operation.
Wow. So less is more.
Less is more.
Okay, so for our listeners then, what are some areas in their life where they could maybe apply this idea?
I think it's really valuable to look at areas where things feel really complicated or overwhelming.
Yeah.
And then to ask yourself, where could I apply this principle of less is more?
Okay.
By consciously cutting out the less significant elements.
So just ruthlessly cut out the
Yeah.
stuff that's not really serving you.
Exactly. And really concentrate on the core drivers of value.
I love that. Okay, chapter 6 focuses on hooking the right customers.
Yes.
This feels really relevant for anyone in business, but even beyond business.
Absolutely.
Just anyone building a network.
Yeah, because not all customers, clients, or even connections are created equal.
Right.
Right. And this principle suggests that it's highly probable that just a small segment of your customer base, let's say the top 20%,
Okay.
are responsible for a huge portion of your profits, maybe as much as 80%.
So the 80-20 rule applies even to like customer relationships.
Absolutely.
Okay, so give me an example of that.
Okay, so let's say you're a software company,
Correct.
and you might have a ton of individual users on those free plans or those really low-cost plans.
Right.
But then you have those enterprise clients,
Okay.
the big corporations
Yeah.
that are paying for those premium subscriptions, the dedicated support.
Yeah.
And those are the ones that are really driving the revenue for the business.
Okay, so it's about identifying like who are those high value customers.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so then in a business context, that's probably pretty clear.
Right.
But even in your personal life,
Yeah.
who are the pieces,
Who are those relationships that are really providing the most value?
Right. Who are the 20% of your relationships that provide 80% of your support now or your inspiration?
Yeah, your opportunities.
Yeah, your opportunities, exactly.
So it's about figuring out like who those people are and really nurturing those relationships.
Yeah, I think recognizing who they are is that critical first step.
Okay, so Chapter 7 broadens our view by outlining the top 10 business uses of this principle.
Yes.
And I think that really underscores just how widely applicable it is.
It really does.
So what are some of those key uses?
Well, it's really showing us that this isn't just some theory, right?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is something that can be applied to a whole bunch of different business functions.
Okay.
So think about product development,
Right.
focusing on the 20% of features that customers are actually using the most.
Right.
Or if you think about cost reduction,
Okay.
identifying the 20% of activities that are responsible for most of your expenses.
Okay.
Even in team management, realizing that maybe a small percentage of your team is responsible for a large amount of the really impactful output. Yeah, and they give this example of a car manufacturer, right?
Yes.
So if they discover that 20% of their parts suppliers are causing like 80% of their production delays,
Right.
then it's like, okay, well, clearly we need to focus on those suppliers.
Well, yeah. Strengthen those relationships or find new suppliers if necessary.
Yeah, it's about really focusing your problem-solving efforts
Exactly. Where they'll have the biggest impact.
on the areas that matter most.
Yeah.
So then the question for our listeners becomes like, what are the specific challenges you're facing
Yes.
in your own business,
In your work.
in your work?
And how could this 80-20 principle help you to really pinpoint the underlying causes and find better, more targeted solutions?
Okay, so kind of view those challenges through this 80-20 lens.
Exactly.
Okay, chapter 8 takes a more personal turn.
Okay.
It's called The Vital Few Give Success to You.
I love that.
So now we're really talking about applying this principle to our own skills and talents.
Yes, to our own unique strengths.
Yeah.
Recognizing that you probably have a small set of core strengths.
Yeah, okay.
And maybe that's only 20% of your overall skills and abilities. But it's those strengths that are really contributing the most to your success and to your happiness.
So instead of trying to be,
Mediocre at everything.
yeah, a jack of all trades, master of none.
Exactly.
You're saying really focus on mastery.
Yeah, focus on those vital few,
Yeah, those vital few things that you're really good at.
the things that you excel at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so give me an example of how that might look.
Sure. So let's say you're a graphic designer
Okay.
and, you're pretty good at a lot of different things. Like you can,
Yeah.
do web design, you can do print design,
Yeah, you can create illustrations.
you can do illustrations.
Yeah, okay.
But let's say you consistently get high-paying clients specifically for your logo designs.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
you're just amazing at creating logos,
Right.
but maybe you struggle with web coding,
Yeah.
so it makes sense in that case.
Yeah.
To really concentrate on what you're best at the logo design and maybe outsource the coding to someone else.
So really play to your strengths.
Yeah, play to your strengths.
And maybe delegate or minimize the things that
the things that are outside of that
that
20%.
they're not so great at.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, Chapter 9 is all about time revolution.
Oh, yes.
Something I think we can all get behind.
We all want more time.
Yeah.
Time is our most precious resource.
It is, and it's finite.
It is.
So the 80-20 principle suggests that we're often not using our time as effectively as we could be.
Yeah, we're not maximizing it.
So what are they saying here?
Well, they're saying that a small fraction of our time, the right 20%,
Okay.
is responsible for the vast majority of our accomplishments. And what we need to do is figure out how to accurately identify and prioritize that 20%.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. So imagine a manager.
Okay.
They might spend a big part of their day just responding to emails,
Oh, yeah.
attending routine meetings,
Right, just kind of like checking things off the to-do list.
checking things off,
Yeah.
feeling busy. But are those activities actually moving the needle?
Right.
So
Yeah.
compare that to like really focused strategic meetings with key team members
Okay.
where big decisions are being made.
Yeah.
Long-term direction is being set. That might only be 20% of their time,
Okay.
but it could be driving 80% of the positive outcomes for the team.
Wow. Okay.
So the lesson here is to really think about how you can reallocate your time towards those high leverage activities.
Yeah, so track your time.
Yeah. Track your time.
See where it's going.
See where your hours are going.
Hmm.
And more importantly, ask yourself, which of those activities are yielding the most significant results?
Yeah, so it's about being really intentional with our time.
It is, yeah.
Chapter 10 offers this really optimistic message.
Okay.
You can always get what you want.
I like that.
It sounds like it's about applying this principle to achieve our personal goals and dreams.
Exactly. And whether that goal is, to save up for a down payment on a house or to get in shape or to learn a new skill, whatever it is.
Yeah.
This principle suggests that there are a small number of key actions that will drive the majority of your progress.
So again, it's about finding that 20%.
Yeah. And focusing on that.
Okay, so give me a tangible example.
Okay. So let's say someone's trying to save for a house.
Okay.
And they're trying to cut back on their spending rate.
Right.
They're like, okay, I'm going to cut back on everything
Across the board.
across the board.
Yeah.
But then when they actually look at their spending habits, they realize that, 80% of their discretionary income is going towards dining out.
Oh.
Or maybe like impulse purchases on Amazon,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Right. Yeah.
And so if they could just focus on reducing their spending in those key areas,
Okay.
they'll make much faster progress towards their savings goal.
Then trying to like nickel and dime it on all the little things.
And instead of cutting out your daily latte.
Yeah.
Maybe cut back on the online shopping sprees.
Yeah. Okay. So the question then becomes like, what are your current personal goals?
Yeah.
What are those few key actions that if you focused on them would make the biggest difference?
Yeah. What would really move the needle for you?
Yeah. Okay. Chapter 11 reminds us that we're not islands here.
That's right.
It's with a little help from our friends.
I like that.
So now we're applying this to our relationships.
Yeah. And it's so important.
It is. Yeah.
Because our networks,
Yeah.
they're so valuable.
Yeah.
But the value that we get from those networks isn't evenly distributed
Right.
across all of our connections.
Oh, okay.
So again, that 80-20 rule comes into play,
Okay.
where it's likely that a small percentage of the people in our lives are providing the majority of the inspiration,
The opportunities.
the opportunities, the crucial advice that we need.
So how does that play out in the real world?
Okay, so let's say you're an entrepreneur.
Okay.
And you've got this wide network,
Yeah.
Lots of people in the industry.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just a handful of key mentors
Okay.
or
Sure.
strategic partners
Yeah.
that are really providing that impactful guidance.
So it's about finding those people and then
And nurturing those relationships.
Yeah, and really nurturing those relationships.
Because those are the ones that are going to make the biggest difference.
Okay. Chapter 12 introduces this concept of intelligent and lazy.
Yes,
Now, at first glance, it sounds like an oxymoron,
it does.
but what are they really talking about here?
Well, they're not talking about, you know, being unproductive or shirking responsibility.
Okay.
They're talking about being strategically efficient.
Okay.
So it's about getting more done by focusing on high return activities rather than just working harder and longer.
Okay.
It's about finding that smartest path to the outcome you want.
So it's about working smart, not hard.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you're a writer
Okay.
and, instead of just sitting down and staring at a blank page,
Yeah.
hoping for inspiration to strike, what if you dedicate a little bit of time up front,
Okay.
maybe 20% of your total writing time,
Yeah.
to crafting a really detailed outline
Okay.
that's going to make the actual writing process so much smoother and so much more efficient?
So it's about spending a little bit of time planning
Yeah,
so that the execution is much easier
exactly.
and then the outcome is better.
Yes.
Okay. So for our listeners then, are there areas where they could apply this?
Yeah, I think it's about asking yourself, are there ways that you could invest a little bit of upfront effort
Okay.
in planning?
Yeah.
Thinking strategically about what you're doing,
Yeah.
optimizing your processes.
Okay.
And that small investment up front will pay off huge dividends later on.
Okay. I like that chapter 13 brings us to money, money, money.
Yeah.
So now we're applying this principle to wealth creation.
Yeah, and the key here is recognizing that not all income streams,
Okay.
investments,
Yeah.
or even business activities are created equal in terms of their returns.
Okay.
So it's often the case that, just a small percentage of your investments
Yeah.
or a very specific part of your business
Okay.
is actually generating the majority of your financial gains.
So give me an example.
Okay, so let's say you're an investor and you have a really well-diversified portfolio.
Okay.
Lots of different stocks and assets.
Yep.
But then you look closely and you realize that maybe just a few of those holdings, like 20% of your portfolio,
Okay.
is responsible for 80% of your gains,
Wow.
right?
Hmm.
And then that might lead you to think, well, maybe I should reallocate my investments and put more money into those high-performing areas.
So really double down on what's working.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the question for our listeners then is what are your income streams or investments that are providing the biggest bang for your buck?
Yeah, where are you getting the best returns
Yeah.
for the time and effort that you're putting in?
So look at your finances through this 80-20 lens.
Exactly.
Okay, and then finally we have chapter 14, which is the 80-20 principle in action.
I like it.
So this is kind of bringing everything together.
Yeah, it's a really nice way to synthesize all of these ideas
Yeah.
and really encourage people to actually apply them.
Yeah, and what they're saying is that the 80-20 rule is not this rigid, unbreakable law.
Right.
It's more of a
Tool.
tool that you can adapt
Yeah,
and apply to your own unique circumstances.
exactly.
And it's really about experimenting with it.
It is.
Seeing what works for you.
Yeah, and learning from what you discover.
Okay, and they give a good example here of a fitness enthusiast.
Oh.
So you've got your fitness enthusiast.
Yeah.
Maybe they're doing all kinds of different exercises.
Sure.
But then they realize that, maybe just a few fundamental compound movements,
Yeah.
like squats and deadlifts, are responsible for most of their strength and muscle gains.
Right.
And so then they can focus on those.
Exactly, and create a really efficient routine
Yeah.
that targets those key exercises.
Okay, so then the encouragement for our listeners is to really think about, where can you start small,
Yeah.
maintain a curious mindset, and really explore where this principle might offer some value.
Yeah, look for those opportunities.
Yeah. So the fundamental takeaway here is that there's this immense power in recognizing that there's this imbalance
Yeah.
between what we put in and the results that we get.
Yes.
And by understanding that a small fraction of what we do typically drives the majority of our results, we can make much more intentional and strategic choices about where we focus our time and energy.
Absolutely, and ultimately achieve more with less.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess the final question for our listeners is,
Right.
is there just one area in your life right now
Yeah.
where you think this principle might be at play?
Yeah, and what are those few activities or factors that you think are really driving the results?
Yeah.
Whether positive or negative?
Yeah.
And then think about you.